Welcome to the Art of Procurement podcast with your host, Philip Eidson. Here, thought leaders share the trends, strategies, and tactics that you can use to elevate the role of procurement and your career.
Hey everybody, it's that time of the week again. It's time for the Art of Procurement Friday show. And today I'm going to continue a topic that I first started to discuss a couple of weeks ago now, and it's on the topic of risk. So we've heard a number of guests talk about the growing importance of risk, but also procurement's role in monitoring, mitigating, and managing those risks. And I think it was back in episode 29 that I gave an overview of 8 different risk factors that we really should be protecting our companies against. Well, after that episode went live, I received a listener question that I think was just a really great question. And the question was this one: how do you integrate the identification of risk into the sourcing process? So again, it's how do you integrate the identification of risk into the sourcing process? And to be honest, that question in itself will probably take a number of shows to answer. You know, it comes with it depends. And when I say it depends, I think, it may differ if you're attempting to incorporate the identification and mitigation of risk into a single sourcing project. And that might be because, for whatever reason, you just want to put a strong focus on the management of risk associated with an individual project. Or you can look at it, more programmatic. So if you want to make risk management programmatic, then you want to have a consistent approach that helps you identify, manage, and mitigate risk across your entire supply base. So for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to assume that the questioner was looking at it on a more programmatic basis. So what I thought I would do today is really just start at the beginning. And, the very beginning question is, how do you actually determine if you should even be monitoring risk related to a specific supplier? And the reason to start there is that not every supplier should be monitored. It just isn't feasible given the number of suppliers that we manage. And frankly, it's not necessary either. What is important, in my experience, though, is that you have a consistent process that determines whether a supplier should be monitored for certain risks. And then if you decide that they should be monitored for certain risks, what are those risks that they should be monitored against? And, when I think of it, the best way to think of it is, and this is relative to sourcing, is that the risk assessment process really becomes the first step in the sourcing process. So every single purchase that you need to make has to pass through that kind of stage gate or decision point in some way, shape, or form. And so if we take a step back, and think about risk, it can take on a couple of different forms. Risk can be present no matter who the supplier is, and it's just based on what you're buying. So, for example, if you're buying a service that requires access to confidential information, it really doesn't matter who the supplier is. There's a risk, there's a red flag there. Or if there's a component that goes into one of your manufactured end items that can't be immediately replaced by another component, it has long lead times, then that's a risk, and that's something that already raises the flags that says, hey, we need to monitor this supplier. But there's some things that just pose no risk at all, at least relative to the cost involved in assessing and monitoring the risk. I don't think it's fair to say that there's ever anything that has zero risk. But oftentimes the management and the mitigation of risk just doesn't come with it an ROI that makes sense to actually, invest the time and the resources in managing. And a much used example there is office supplies. So if your supplier lets you down, then yes, it's kind of a bummer. It means that you can't print anything for half an hour. So there is risk associated with it, but you can just head out to the store. It's an inconvenience, but it's not a showstopper. The second dimension to risk, if that's the first dimension, relative to what you're buying, the second dimension is risk related to the supplier itself. So it might be that the product and service that you buy has some characteristics that you want to closely manage from a risk perspective, but the supplier that you select, when you do a risk assessment, they have all the controls in place that you require and expect, and maybe they go above and beyond and have even more robust systems and processes in place. So if they do, then that will minimize the amount of risk monitoring that you required because they already have those controls. On the flip side, they may have no controls, or you may not have confidence that they can apply those controls consistently, which means you may want to put a much stringent kind of risk governance process in place with them. So essentially, what you're doing is at the start of each project, or ideally, and this is kind of what we want to get to at procurement, is to be really engaged early, is get engaged at the time when you're making that make-buy decision. You need to start segmenting the project based on the risk that, first of all, is inherent with the product or the service that you're buying. And the first step to do that would be to assign a risk tier. And this is an example. So you can assign a risk tier to whatever it is that you buy. So when you're considering what goes into determining a risk tier for what you buy, and think of this, on a category level, for example, then, you could ask things like if whoever you select, are they going to have access to confidential data, employee data, or customer data? Another question is the performance of the product or service that's being purchased critical to the operation of your business? That's going to impact how much, whether you want to dedicate resources to the monitoring of risk associated with it. Another question, kind of touched on this earlier, is how quickly can you replace the chosen supplier with an alternative if they're suddenly unable to provide the product or service that you've bought? You want to ask if you anticipate that any chosen supplier may perform work from an offshore location. Are you outsourcing a process that was previously an internal process? And another question is around spend. So perhaps none of those apply, but it may be you're buying something that has a large spend, or the spend is large, is material to you. So, an example is, would a price increase, for example, have a material impact on your ability to maintain profitability or be competitive? And if the answer is yes, even though all the other things may be no, then it's something that you probably want to place, kind of monitor a little bit more from a risk perspective. So there's a number of other questions, I would say, but those ones provide an insight into kind of how you start thinking about this. And then based on the responses to this questionnaire, then you're going to be able to decide whether or not you need to closely consider risk as part of the sourcing process. And if so, to what extent are you going to want to start looking at risk and assessing risk? The answers should also drive the different risk factors that you might want to measure and mitigate through the sourcing process. So, for example, it may be that you only answered yes to services being provided in an offshore location, but no other risk factors are present. If that's the case, then you really only want to consider geopolitical risk, for example, when assessing the supplier, and making sure that you're covered, or that you have contingencies in the SOW, the contract, and the governance program related to potential risks associated with that. But it could be that multiple risk factors are present, and that would require a much thorough consideration of risk throughout the sourcing process. So what you will find over time is that, it starts to become clear what types of product and services you buy have an inherent amount of risk associated with them. So what you can start doing is, when you're tiering things, you can start assigning risk ratings based on the product or service taxonomy that you have in place. So that means that you don't actually have to do the assessment itself every time you buy something, but only on the products and services that are in the same taxonomy as something that you've already determined requires a closer look from a risk perspective. So it seems like it probably sounds like it's daunting, but it doesn't have to be if you carry out that risk assessment on your taxonomy and then just apply that every time you buy something. Okay, so I hope that provides some insight into how you can start thinking about integrating risk into the sourcing process. The first step being, as we just talked through, is determining the level of risk associated with the product or service that you're buying, and then only then can you decide if you need to invest the time, the energy, the resources into undertaking a more thorough risk, a more thorough supplier level risk assessment. I mentioned at the beginning that this really needs to be the topic of multiple shows. So what I do plan on doing in a forthcoming Art of Procurement show, probably within the next couple of weeks here, I hope anyway, is to cover that second part of the equation. how do you start thinking about what supplier level risks you need to be identifying and mitigating through the sourcing process, and what are some of the questions that you need to ask that kind of trigger different areas of risk that you need to think about. So I'd love to hear what you think. If you have the identification and mitigation of risk built into your sourcing process, does this kind of mirror your first step of what you're doing, or are you doing things differently? I would really love for you to let me know and kind of tell me how you're doing things. You can do that by the usual ways, and leave a comment on the comments field of the website. It's probably the quickest way to do that. Okay, well, thanks for listening to another Art of Procurement Friday show. The subject of risk, I think, is one that we're going to dive a lot deeper into, so definitely watch this space for more. With that being said, I hope you enjoy the rest of the week, and I'll be back on Tuesday with another Art of Procurement Tuesday interview show. Okay, thanks for listening, and talk to you again soon. Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.